Recording in progress.
Hello, so I'm going to discuss Chandra Mohanty's essay Under Western Eyes, which is from the syllabus. And I'm going to talk about it in different sections. Firstly, I'll discuss the essay theoretically, and I'll discuss the kind of broad theoretical points that Mohanty is making. Then I will discuss some of the finer points of the article, specifically the tropes that Mohanty draws upon when critiquing the ways that Western feminism constructs a monolithic third world woman. Then I will discuss some practical examples, like issues such as sexual violence and the ways that this binary between Western feminism and feminism in the global South, or Western feminism and the third world woman, can be complicated. And I'll also discuss transgender and queer rights. And finally, I will talk about the implications of Mohanty's work. So, Chandra Mohanty is critical of binaries and the ways that binaries between self and other, um, colonized and colonizer, um, free and unfree, are not really helpful, nor are they accurate. So, more than being reflective of reality, Mohanty, like many other post structuralist thinkers whom we've discussed, including Judith Butler, uh, argues that binaries are not real. They're constructed for political purposes and for the purposes of really creating hierarchy. So rather than there being natural or innate or unchanging differences between self and other, between Western feminist and third world woman, these categories are actually constituted through discourse, through Western feminist discourse, which is dependent on or which is inextricable from colonial discourse and Western imperialist discourse. And this construction of the third world woman is actually a construct that allows the Western feminist to articulate a certain subject position and to mask certain realities of class antagonism, racial privilege, and also certain realities of sexism or misogyny, rape, class exploitation in the global north. So Mohanty states in the essay, Chandra Mohanty states, without the overdetermined, without the overdetermined discourse that creates the third world, there would be no singular and privileged first world. Without the third world woman, the particular self presentation of Western women mentioned above would be problematical. I'm suggesting then that the one enables and sustains the other. This is not to say that the signature of Western feminist writings on the Third World has the same authority as the project of Western humanism. However, in the context of the hegemony of the Western scholarly establishment in the production and dissemination of texts, and in the context of the legitimating imperative of humanistic and scientific discourse, the definition of the Third World woman as a monolith might well tie into the larger economic and ideological praxes of disinterested scientific inquiry and pluralism, which are the surface manifestations of a latent economic and cultural colonization of the non-Western world. It is time to move beyond the Marx, who found it possible to say they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. So this class antagonism of ones who cannot represent themselves and must be represented was first discussed by Marx when talking about the relationship between the bourgeoisie and workers. And this ideological violence, the violence of ideas, is central to Marx, and as we discussed in the first lecture, central to Antonio Gramsci's understanding of hegemony. Hegemony being a hegemonic set of ideas that rule over us and that always take us back to the minds and ideas of the ruling class as being more important than all others. And this battle over ideas is part of what Marxists term superstructure. So superstructure and base form the kind of rubric of class antagonism as an ongoing project that is not only about work and labor, but about one's mind and one's life. And so at the base is the work that we do. The superstructure are the ideas, the kind of institutions that impart the ideology of the ruling class over generations so that those who work will never question authority. And the superstructure is obviously the state, but it is also ideas, education, language, culture. So Chandra Mohanty is interested in the ways that Western feminism is implicated in this project, which is a colonial project and a project of class hierarchy. So, by constructing the third world woman as being someone who is necessarily weak or oppressed in comparison to the first world woman, Western feminist writings are really self-aggrandizing, self-congratulatory, self-centered in many ways. And this kind of self-centered rhetoric, firstly, constructs the woman in the global South as being a victim, and a victim whose consummate suffering or victimization requires Western intervention in the form of sometimes imperialism, aid, tide aid, war. Secondly, this construct of the first world woman or the Western woman as being superior to and as being in a position to speak on behalf of the woman in the global South masks all of the ways that misogyny, sexism, rape culture, domestic violence, misogynoir, sexist forms of racism, all of these processes exist in the global North, irrespective of what Lola Olufemi terms neoliberal feminism. So Lola Olufemi wrote a book called Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. And Olufemi critiques neoliberal forms of feminism, or what has been termed after Mohanty white feminism. So after Chandra Mohanty wrote this essay under Western Eyes many years ago, terms like white feminism, critiques of white feminism became really popular in the media and in gender studies scholarship. So Olufemi's argument is that neoliberalism has really shaped mainstream feminist writing and also branding and popular culture. So, at the heart of the neoliberal feminist project is the desire to make money, but the desire to make money for oneself as a individual subject. So, liberalism refers to liberal philosophy. It is the idea of individualism, equality, rationality, and the founders of modern liberalism thought in legalistic and rational terms: one person, one vote, one person, one income or bank account that is mine, that I don't have to share with others. That is liberalism. But neoliberalism is really a new form of liberalism, and it often involves not just one person, one vote, or one person, one job. It involves one person as a brand. So neoliberal feminism is really about the branding of the self. Problem is that the branding of the self often happens against all others as competitors. It often involves then speaking on behalf of others or trying to represent others to support one's own individual capitalist interests, irrespective of actual people whom one could speak on behalf of, or take photographs of, or write books about for their own interests. This kind of neoliberal feminism is not then a project of collective liberation, and it is not necessarily an ethical project. It is one that involves, in many ways, theft of someone else's narrative. It involves ruthless forms of self interest. And it can be a really racist set of ideas that imply that other people cannot speak on their own behalf. So Chandra Mohanty then is interested in a critique of this kind of self other dichotomy. Firstly, from a political perspective, Mohanty wants to question the ways that writings about the quote third world woman often involve an infantilizing colonial gaze that imagines that women in the global south cannot speak on their own behalf. Shireen Razak has also written extensively about the imperiled Muslim woman who appears in media since the global war on terror as a character who is somehow a victim constantly. And this kind of constant victimization is also about race and racist tropes, so that one sees the bodies of certain people, and specifically certain women, and here's their names. These ideas of suffering and victimization are popular in the media. And there's an entire genre of documentary film, of writing, that imagines that women from the global south or in the global south are victims of patriarchy. And this is one of the tropes that Mohanty discusses. So Mohanty discusses a whole series of kind of stereotypical narratives about women in the global south. Being a victim of religious persecution is one of these tropes. And while obviously there are many women who are in the global south and from the global south who are victims of religious persecution, these narratives of victimization from men and the family are really just are kind of repetitive narratives that refuse to appreciate the nuanced ways in which people live their lives. They also involve a sense of benevolence, the construction of the white gaze or the white Western gaze as being one of salvation, of care and benevolence, masks economic interests. And I guess one can turn to Marx, that religion for Marx is the opiate of the masses. So if people in the global south are religious, is this really because of their class position and the use of religion as a way of finding comfort or seeking solace or finding communion or community in the context of unemployment and poverty? Another kind of narrative or another staging of the third world woman involves stories of women in the global south or from the global south who are always victims of men and patriarchy. And this victimization ranges from sensationalized media narratives or highly publicized media narratives of women who are victims of male violence. And the violence is violence done to women by men who are of the same religion or ethnic community or in the same country in the global south. The rates of domestic violence and rape and child abuse are extremely high in countries in the global south. And I don't think that anyone would discount this, but the broader context of poverty, of corruption, of post colonialism, and the kind of states and the kind of system of voting or system of government that was left in place after British colonial rule obviously structures a lot of interpersonal violence or stress or hardship in the global south. Um, so, gender as an organizing principle that makes sense of people's lives is perhaps one idea, but in the context of countries in the global south where people do starve to death and where are so many stark differences between people's lives because of money and class, then perhaps gender is not as important as class. So Mohanty is interested also in the ways that sex and sexual violence are central to these constructions of the third world woman. And there is the sense of almost colonial perversion or infantilization, but also um, the kind of quizzical exoticism that is directed towards women in and from the global south is often about sex and um, irrespective of the really obvious issues of economic injustice and poverty, this kind of quizzical exoticism and perversion towards sex and the ways that people have sex in the global south and the ways that women have sex or if they give birth to children is perhaps part of colonial history and colonial discourse. The fascination with the way that women in the global south or from the global south look with skin color, with religion, with dress, is perhaps a form of racial exoticism that does not really address any actual concerns that women in the global south might have. Like, while there are obviously problems of sexual violence, rape, in the context of countries that are often on the brink of war or where there are civil wars and where people often contract cancer quite easily because of chemical spills at factories, or where people have to scavenge for food or basic necessities because of poverty, then the fixation on sex is perhaps really about a Western gaze. And more than accuracy, one can think about what a Western consumer or writer gains by focusing on certain issues like sex or the family or the bodies of third world women. And what Mohanty argues is that using gender as an organizing principle, or what writers have termed gender centric feminism, allows Western women to see themselves in the narratives of women in the global South, but to also construct themselves as omnipotent or objective narrators. And this takes us back to Sandra Harding. So, Sandra Harding has argued that there is no objectivity, there is no kind of placeless or nameless author who can look at things and judge objectively, and who can look at people at a distance and judge objectively. Harding argues that we all have a certain subject position, and that this subject position allows us to narrate certain stories, and it is the place from which we perceive a reality, which is not just objective reality, it is our own narration of events. So the ways that Western feminist scholarship constructs women in the global South and imagines their lives and imagines their relationships with others is from a very specific point of view. So, what is the cost of this kind of construction of the monolithic third world woman? Firstly, I think the cost is that there cannot be any real solidarity if there is hierarchy. And if this hierarchy is constantly used to suggest that women in the global South, they're from the global South, or women of color who are working class and poor need someone to speak on their behalf, or are incapable um, of having agency. Secondly, this kind of construction of the monolithic third world woman allows Western feminist scholarship and activism to be involved in a project of gratitude um, that does not politicize um, sexism and racism in the global north. So, if one is constantly told that they should be grateful because women in other countries are suffering and they would all uh, do anything they could in the world to come to Canada and to live in Canada or the US, then this rhetoric of otherness actually ends up inadvertently or purposefully um, normalizing violence and labor exploitation and crime against women, and it's specifically feminists in the global north. So if there is always somewhere else, then the place that we are in starts to be unquestioned. So the somewhere else that I construct as being so much worse than here involves this kind of romanticization of the global north. And cultures of rape exist throughout the world. Rape culture, sexual harassment, domestic violence exist everywhere. So, I mean, the global Me Too movement was one example of symmetry between people's lives and workplace situations throughout the world because of sexual harassment. And also because of activism against sexual harassment, which has often passed new laws and policies throughout the world. Finally, I think that Mohanty's argument is theoretical and philosophical in nature. It is really an argument that is in conversation with a lot of post colonial scholars who are interested in self other binaries and the way that binary thinking of self and other, of good and bad, really structure language and even politics. Chandra Mohanty's essay is a really well cited piece of scholarship. And um, in this piece of scholarship, I think Mohanty looks at the ways that projection and transference, which are psychological terms, can shape academic scholarship and even labor and political belief. So rather than projecting onto another, um, Mohanty's essay asks us to consider the importance of ourselves as people who can bear witness to the world and take action, but must still live our own lives. So I'm going to stop the first part there. Thank you. I hope you're doing well. This is just part one. And we'll play around with different formats. We'll have PowerPoint as well, and I'll use different formats. So you have a variety of options to consider Chandra Mohanty's essay, Under Western Eyes.